The A-1H Skyraider flies out in War Thunder. Don't forget to flush. The Douglas A-1 Skyraider is an interesting case study from the Cold War period of an aircraft that was essentially obsolete as soon as it first flew, but soldiered on for decades simply because nothing else could replace it. The original plane was first drawn up during World War II for the US Navy, and the prototype flew for the first time in 1946 with the designation XBT-2D-1 Skyraider. Gotta love those Navy designations. It was put into service as the AD-1, then upgraded to the AD-2, AD-3, and so on. During the Korean War, the AD Skyraider was still the primary strike plane for the US Navy and the Marine Corps, where its range and enormous payload quickly dispelled any doubts about the usefulness of a piston-engined attack plane at the dawn of the jet age. Despite its features, about 100 of them were lost in combat over the course of the war, but it still proved an effective attacker overall. Now, when the Vietnam War got going, the Skyraider, which by now was redesignated the A-1, was still the backbone of carrier-based strike aviation for the United States, and was even in use by the U.S. Air Force. A large number were handed off to the Republic of Vietnam Air Force, and saw extensive combat over the entire conflict, with both American and Vietnamese pilots at the controls. In one noteworthy sortie, in celebration of having dropped 6 million pounds of bombs, an A-1H dropped a makeshift toilet bomb, becoming the first time that a modern toilet was ever deployed as a weapon in combat, but everyone involved knew it was mostly a joke, and there weren't any expectations that it would actually do any damage. Over the years, the Skyraider was upgraded to a handful of versions, with the A-1H being the final version produced in any significant quantity. It featured a new dive brake setup, a new bombing system, a modified hardpoint system strengthened for heavier loads, and some refinements to the cockpit armor. The United States finally retired the Skyraider in 1973. Not bad for a plane that came out of the Second World War. What we get in War Thunder is the A-1H Skyraider, the event prize for the Smell of Victory Battle Pass season in 2022. This is a strike aircraft in Rank 4 of the U.S. Tech Tree, with a battle rating of 6.3. Despite being a propeller plane in the middle tiers, the A-1H carries a built-in countermeasures dispenser, giving it 60 charges for chaff or flares. This is actually a historically accurate detail, despite not being useful in the game unless the plane is used in higher-tiered matches. The main armament is a set of 4 20mm M3 cannons, which get a pretty flexible selection of ammo belts. They have a total of 800 rounds of ammo and generally punch pretty hard. The loadouts on the A-1H are where it shines. This thing can carry an absolutely enormous amount of dumb bombs, unguided rockets, napalm, and even 7.62mm minigun pods. Now, the minigun pods don't get any selectable ammo belts or anything, but they can still be very useful, and more on that later. Now, of course, the plane also has a secret hidden up its sleeve. If you use the custom loadout creator, you can place a special weapon on the outermost right side weapon pylon. It can actually take the toilet bomb. This is obviously here as a joke, and it doesn't really do any damage, even though the stat card looks like a regular weapon. It just flops around in the air when you drop it. But I did confirm that using one on a strategic base does tag the base for the purposes of getting destruction credit. So, I guess it's not a complete waste? The flight performance of the A-1H is largely what you're probably expecting. This is a sluggish, heavy, piston-engined bomber. Its climb performance isn't great, and it gets even worse when it flies out with a weapons load. This combines with some pretty awful energy retention to create some really tricky attack profiles. Now, what I mean is, since this plane doesn't have any kind of aiming guides for its bombs, like at all, no bomb sight, no ballistics computer or anything like that, you're basically forced to use dive bombing attacks if you want any hope of actually hitting anything on the ground. But when you pull out of a dive, a huge amount of that energy gets wasted, and it's really difficult to climb back out again. Now, in terms of maneuverability, the news isn't good. Its turning ability at low speeds is noticeably worse than most single-engine props, and its poor energy retention means that it can get energy trapped very easily in a dogfight, and it's especially vulnerable to vertical maneuvers. If you're coming in from a dive, you get exactly one good energy turn out of it. But after that, or in basically any other flight situation, the A-1H's agility just isn't there. It's also not especially fast, and it accelerates pretty slowly. Now, thankfully, it does get an air spawn in most situations, which helps out quite a bit, because at lower speeds, all of its performance suffers badly. The maneuverability, the rate of climb, all of it is noticeably worse below around 400 kilometers an hour, but it can take a while to get there, even longer if you've got a chunky loadout, and the vast majority of the time you're flying this plane is going to be spent waiting for speed that may or may not ever arrive before you get intercepted. The plane can safely deploy combat flaps up to around 360 kilometers an hour, and its wings won't rip until a little below 800. Taking the A-1H into battle really depends on the game mode. In arcade battles, the in-flight rearming can make this thing an absurdly effective points grinder, and its insane bomb load rivals twin-engine bombers, and even comes close to some of the heavier four-engined ones. The miniguns can absolutely shred air targets through pure rate of fire, but just remember that they have different ballistics from the cannons. Still, ammo is plentiful, so when in doubt, just hold the trigger till something blows up. Plus, its maneuverability is much better in arcade, which allows it to defend itself a bit better than in realistic battles. But traditional dogfighters are still going to crush this thing most of the time. In realistic battles, it can destroy about a base and a half on most maps, but it's very vulnerable to interception when it's carrying a bomb load. And actually hitting ground targets may take a lot of practice without any kind of ballistics guide. The miniguns can still shred air targets, and can actually be more effective than in arcade battles, since the superficial damage can be harder to recover from in RB, and even low-caliber gunfire can still take out control lines, light up fuel tanks, or hit pilots and crew. And the sheer quantity of fire coming out of the gun pods can throw some heavy pain. But just remember, it's still not a dogfighter, and the agility isn't there. In close air support, your success is really going to depend on two primary factors: the presence or competence of enemy AAA, and how good you are at using unguided bombs without any ballistics guide. This is a slow, huge target that's easy to shoot down, and although it can take some large bombs, it's still challenging to get consistent hits with them. And when you want to make accurate bomb drops, you have to fly low, which makes you very vulnerable to AAA. The rockets are generally ineffective most of the time, as they're too far out on the wings to aim accurately, and you need direct hits to take out even light vehicles with them. A special note here, in all game modes, this thing can get matched into fighting entry-level jets, and it's insanely vulnerable to high-energy hit-and-run tactics, so keep an eye out. Visually, the A-1H is a weird-looking plane. The back half of it looks like a medium bomber or a cargo plane, while the front half looks like a fighter. You don't get any paint jobs that are especially interesting, so we're going to have to wait and see what the live community comes up with. Overall, kind of a meh-looking aircraft. Landing can be tricky, but it's not difficult. The engine is very heavy, so this thing can nose over pretty easily if you lock up the brakes, and sometimes it's going to need a really long landing run. The air brakes retract when you put the gear out, which can make managing airspeed a little more tricky than usual, and its landing flaps can only drop once you're below around 250 kilometers an hour. So tricky, but not difficult. Just practice a few times and you'll probably get the hang of it. The cockpit on this plane gives excellent all-around visibility. Better than a lot of fighters, in fact, and the instruments are easy to read and in good positions. The reflex sight is pretty solid, and overall, this plane has a really good cockpit. To close out on the Douglas A-1H Skyraider. This plane gets countermeasures at a very low BR. It carries an absurd load of bombs. It carries an absurd load of 7.62mm miniguns. It has a cheaper pair cost along with premium bonuses, and it drops toilet bombs. However, it's a large, slow target with poor energy retention. It lumbers in air combat, all of its weapons are blind, and it goes up against jet fighters. The final verdict on the A-1H is that this plane has the potential to be a really strong grinder, and it can be a lot of fun to play, especially with all those miniguns. But it does get shot down a lot, and the lack of any ballistic aids leads to a pretty big learning curve for effective close air support. As always, thanks for watching.